Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Collaboration Across the Integrated Regional Water Management Program and the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, focused on groundwater recharge. We have over 350 registrants for today's session, so we're going to go ahead and get things started. We've got a lot to cover today. As you all are joining, we would encourage you to type into the chat your name, your organization, and your location today. Excited to see some familiar names. We're going to go ahead and get started with some quick introductory notes. As some of you may know, my name is Emily Finnegan. I am the Water Project Manager at the Local Government Commission. For those of you who are not familiar with LGC, we are a statewide nonprofit who have been supporting local governments for over 40 years to implement integrated sustainable development work across water, climate change, energy, community design, and national service. LGC, Maven's Notebook, and the IRWM Roundtable of Regions have been hosting a lunch hour webinar series to elevate how we can better coordinate across the IRWM program and implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Today is the third webinar in our series, and we'll be highlighting how IRWM regions and GSAs can better collaborate to plan, fund, and implement multi-benefit recharge projects. Our speakers today will also be highlighting tools, resources, and lessons learned to support public agencies in developing recharge projects. Encourage you to keep typing this information into the chat. We're going to go into a quick poll for us to get a high-level sense of who we have with us this afternoon. Chris, if you can go ahead and launch our poll. Please select which agency, organization, or community you are associated with. We know you may be associated with more than one, so go ahead and pick the best fit for your affiliation. And while we're doing that, I'm going to go over a few quick Zoom webinar technical pieces. We will be having some time today for Q&A, and you can access the Q&A through the button at the bottom of your Zoom panel. You'll see there in the screen. Once you have that function open, you'll be able to type your question in and it will show up to everyone here. There is an option to upvote. You'll see there's the little thumbs up. If you want to support someone else's question, we will prioritize questions that are upvoted and rise to the top. You are automatically muted as you join today. Just one piece to note, and we are recording today's webinar. If you do need to jump off at any point, we will be sharing the webinar recording and all of the resources that are shared today with everyone. And with that, Chris, how are we doing on the poll?
I think we have 80% now voted, so let's give a few more seconds for the last ones in.
That sounds great.
Okay, and let's share our results here.
Excellent. We have 38% is our strongest representative here from government agencies, and the next highest is water agencies. Chris, I'm just seeing in the Q&A that chat is disabled, so I see that noted. We'll try to address that. I'll see if I can send something out to you all just to test that. While I am doing that, I'm going to turn things over to Chris Maven Austin, as some of you may know her as, who is the thought leader and talented journalist behind Maven's Notebook and the Groundwater Exchange. Chris?
Hi, thank you, Emily. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Chris Austin. I'm otherwise known as Maven, and I publish the California Water News website, Maven's Notebook, where you can always find the latest California water news and information. I also publish two other websites I want to tell you about. The first is the California Water Library, which is a free online repository of California water documents curated from agency websites, NGOs, research and journal articles, and even some documents that have been scanned especially for the library that haven't been found elsewhere on the web. The library's also been online for several years now, and a lot of the documents in there were curated from agency websites before they had to remove a lot of those documents for accessibility purposes. So the next time you're looking for a document, try the California Library at cawaterlibrary.net. My third website is the Groundwater Exchange, which is a website that collects and organizes resources for SGMA implementation from DWR, the State Water Board, NGOs, and others. There are pages on projects and actions such as groundwater recharge, as well as pages on avoiding undesirable results, a video gallery, an intro to SGMA page in both English and Spanish, and a free bi-weekly SGMA implementation newsletter. So I invite you to check it out at groundwaterexchange.org. And coming in the next few weeks, I'll be launching a new main page that will better highlight the wealth of information contained on the website. So stay tuned. So thank you again for attending today's webinar. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kamyar Guivetchi. He's the manager of the Division of Planning and Local Assistance at DWR, and he will be moderating today's panel. Welcome, Kamyar.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Emily. And thank you, everyone, for participating in today's webinar. Happy summer solstice. It's befitting that we're having this webinar on this day. I understand they're going to be putting short bios for myself and the panelists in the chat, so we don't have to take time away from the discussion. But what I would like to share with you is my mantra is connecting dots. My passion is spanning silos. And my superpower are these rose-colored glasses that help keep me optimistic and moving forward. Next, please. So what I'd like to do is provide some context before turning it over to our three great panelists. And as you well know, California water is really about the extremes, the wet and the dry cycles. And with climate change, those are becoming more frequent and more consequential. We're in the midst of one of our dry extremes, and it is really important for us to think about what we need to do to modernize and reinvigorate our water management system to adapt to that. Next, please. So given that as a context, the administration has put together the water resilience portfolio, and it's really predicated on regions developing networks and being in the front with state support. And it's also predicated on us taking that regional approach, particularly at watershed scales, and looking for ways to use natural green infrastructure to get those multiple benefits. Next, please. So I really like this graphic. This flower represents our water sectors. And historically, and even today, we tend to operate around the periphery of those petals where there's little or no overlap between them. And so for really addressing those extremes and achieving the initiatives of the state, including SGMA implementation, we are going to have to look for much bigger scale collaboration, the alignment between our various agencies, and the co-management of our water management sectors. And that's what we mean by integrated water management, to get the most out of our water system and recognize that our institutional overlays have really fragmented and made parts of that water system dysfunctional. Next, please. So, oops, I think there's one slide. There it is. Flood managed aquifer recharge, or FloodMAR, I think really epitomizes this integrated water management approach. There's many facets of it. It has to be public-private partnership. It's multi-sector, scalable from a farm all the way to a watershed, multifaceted, as I'll present in a minute. And then it's an untapped part of our water portfolio. Next, please. So FloodMAR at the watershed scale really takes on a headwater to groundwater approach. And this is where we're going to need, first and foremost, that big collaboration, agency alignment, and sector co-management, because the many activities that you see on this slide, from forecast-informed reservoir operations all the way down to working with farmers and landowners for putting floodwaters onto working landscapes, and doing it in a way to provide terrestrial and aquatic habitat benefits. That requires working across multiple institutions, multiple water sectors to make that work. Next, please. So the state is on the record in multiple planning documents and efforts that flood managed aquifer recharge is something that we need to invest in. Next, please. And ways that the state of California can help increase and fast track FloodMAR is, first and foremost, we have to recognize aquifers as natural infrastructure, just like we do forests and floodplains and riverine habitats. We have to protect our prime recharge areas and make sure we don't pave over that which can help us reconnect our surface and groundwater systems, and create the fiscal and regulatory incentives that can help replenish our aquifers through groundwater recharge projects. And then ultimately, we have to promote those watershed networks that can help build capacity and implement the needed multi-sector, multi-benefit projects. Next, please. In 2019, we held a 2-day FloodMAR forum. And there you see Secretary Karen Ross as the keynote speaker. We had 200 people participating on each of those days, and they came up with a dozen recommendations to meet these various goals. Also in the chat, there should be links to the various resources that I'm referring to. Next, please. So at the Department of Water Resources, our FloodMAR activities involve doing watershed studies, currently in the Merced and Tuolumne watersheds, conducting or developing guidance through white papers, research and data development plans and technical memoranda, and pilot projects beginning to partner with local entities on plan formulation, again, at multiple scales, and then working to build a FloodMAR network to connect all of these things together. Next, please. The Department of Water Resources, through our SGMA office, has a number of technical and financial assistance programs that will be implemented over the next 4 years. Next, please. There are also DWR and state board financial assistance programs to allocate Prop 1, Prop 68 grants for improving groundwater management and doing it in a way that provides those multiple benefits. And there are links to those resources. Next, please. And this is just my contact information. So while it's up there, what I'm going to do is ask our 3 panelists to put on their video as I introduce them. So we have Daniel Mountjoy, who's the Director of Resource Stewardship at Sustainable Conservation. We have Rob Swartz, a Manager of Technical Services at the Regional Water Authority and the American River Basin IRWM. We also have Mike Brinton, a roadside drainage and stormwater program engineer with Stanislaus County. Today's panel discussion will begin by each of our panelists providing a brief overview of the work they're doing. And then we'll follow that by a few questions to the panelists that I'll ask. But while they're doing that, please jot down your questions for the panelists and enter it in the Q&A function of this Zoom session. So with that, I'm going to ask Daniel Mountjoy to provide his overview.
Thank you, Kamyar. And let me just open up my slide here and should have that now. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm pleased to be able to participate in this discussion. I'm going to be presenting from the perspective of someone who's not as involved in the IRWM process, but more in the recharge on the ground side of things and facing the kinds of questions that farmers and GSAs and irrigation districts are starting to ask regarding their recharge projects. And really what I want to point out is the value of integrating with IRWM in order to answer some of these questions and implement and fund more multi-benefit type projects. So at Sustainable Conservation, we've been working since 2011 on recharge, starting with Don Cameron down in Fresno County. And early on in that process, we identified a lot of growers who are interested in doing recharge. As early as 2016, we had 130 sites, 10 different crops, 14,000 acres, where people and individual landowners were starting to talk about wanting to participate in recharge to augment their groundwater supply. And some of the barriers that they were identifying were the challenges of coordination with their irrigation districts and other land use management groups and the agronomic uncertainty. Our work continued with grower outreach events and workshops to try and increase that exchange of information, broaden the awareness of where the water was available and how growers could actually start to participate in this kind of work. This led us to then working with irrigation districts. And in this map, I'm showing the districts and regions that we're currently working, developing recharge programs. And we really started out in Madera and Tulare irrigation districts with recharge programs in 2017 when we had a lot of excess water. And those district run efforts were focused on promoting the capture and recharge in district operated recharge basins and on private. Together with the districts, started to identify incentives and agreements to encourage growers to take that water. Everything from the districts agreeing to provide free water to growers that would take it for recharge or contracts to accept excess water. The results were that in 2019 in Madera Irrigation District alone, they had as many growers doing recharge as, or the amount of water recharged by the growers were initially single purpose with the idea of maximizing groundwater replenishment and increasing groundwater storage. As we started working with the groups, we identified the opportunity to look at other benefits as well and developed a tool called the Groundwater Recharge Assessment Tool to help identify cost-effective, optimal combinations of recharge across different types of recharge methods in order to maximize that capture of water. And the tool started to evolve as we learned from different water managers what the kind of objectives they had on their minds. And so it's really driven by a dialogue amongst stakeholders to define the purpose of the recharge projects and to consider the trade-offs in costs and management within the subbasin. Other indicators besides simply maximizing recharge. And that's really where IRWM and the multi-benefits come in. More recently, in our work with DWR and the Merced Irrigation District region, we've taken a look at if you simply maximize recharge to try and put as much water on the ground in the best places, it ends up that some of that water leaves the area through subsurface flows out into other regions. In fact, as much as half. Some of that water moves back into streams and seeps into the channels during dry seasons in subsequent years. And a portion of it stays to achieve that initial goal of simply maximizing groundwater storage. But what we've been working on there is the idea that if we define the objective for recharge in different ways, you end up applying water in different places or through different methods to achieve different outcomes, each of which has different metrics and benefits. So in this map of the Merced Irrigation District in dark blue is the area to achieve maximum in-basin retention of recharge based on groundwater models and where that water would flow. But if instead your goal was to enhance community drinking water and well reliability, the areas in orange and yellow would be where you'd want to prioritize recharge because they're most closely affiliated with disadvantaged communities and groundwater dependent community well systems. Or if what you wanted to do was prioritize recharge for shorebird habitat, you might apply it on poorer soils to increase migratory bird nest or feeding locations. Or over in the western portion in dark blue would be areas you'd want to recharge to maximize groundwater dependent ecosystem recovery and return flows to the streams, the Merced and the San Joaquin River. So this gaining of knowledge about thinking about where you and when you would do recharge
Looks like we have lost Daniel. Kamyar, I'm wondering if I could invite you back on screen while we work with Daniel to figure that out. Maybe we can jump to Rob.
Yeah, so let's, sorry for that, everyone. What I'm going to do is invite Rob Swartz to provide his overview, and hopefully we'll get Daniel back. Is that Daniel? That's Rob. So hopefully we'll get Daniel back and he can finish up his remarks. Rob?
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, Rob.
Thanks. My phone says I'm on mute, but just want to confirm that you all can hear me. Thanks, and that was really pretty tragic. Daniel's talk is very interesting. I was really kind of wrapped up in that. So I will introduce myself. I'm with the Regional Water Authority. That's a joint powers authority that formed in 2001, consisting of 20 local water suppliers in the greater Sacramento region. That ultimately came together to implement something we call the Water Form Agreement. And that's really one of the original integrated plans in the state. So this was a plan to provide for the region's water supply through the year 2030, while protecting the important habitat values of the Lower American River system. So we were starting on regional water planning, integrated regional water planning at the time that, the whole concept came out from the state a couple of decades ago. So we were sort of uniquely positioned to become the IRWM lead. And what you can see in the figure here in the middle is our IRWM region, which includes portions of Placer, Sacramento, in Sacramento counties. We don't include Sutter County, but we do have a lot of coordination with them, especially given the fact that we overlie the same subbasin in the North American subbasin. So when SGMA passed, we then have these 3 groundwater subbasins that are trying to come into compliance with SGMA. And we're working very closely with each of these subbasins. The North American subbasin, which is shown on the left, includes 5 GSAs. And we're going to talk about this flood MAR today, managed aquifer recharge direct methods, but it's really worth noting that our region has really done a lot of indirect recharge or in-lieu recharge. In particular, in the North American subbasin, we have a fairly large interconnected urban distribution system. We had overdraft historically, and we were able to correct that by getting surface water in wet years out to agencies that were over-reliant on groundwater. So right now we can operate and recharge water through in-lieu means on a scale of about 20 to 30,000 acre feet per year. And we've had very significant benefits to the North American subbasin through that method. Then we have the South American subbasin in the middle. A little more detail you can see on the upper right. They also have 5 GSAs that are operating within that subbasin. And similar, they have called the Freeport Regional Water Project, which some of you may have heard of, came online about a decade ago. And they've been able to practice some additional in lieu conjunctive use again in that urban water area, and they've been able to correct the overdraft conditions. But as you move further south in that South American subbasin, and then ultimately down into the Cosumnes subbasin, this is a very rural area that has been largely reliant on groundwater. And Kamyar showed you the floodmar graphic, and one of those things that floodmar relies on is having this upstream reservoir that captures large volumes of water and then can release it. The Cosumnes River system is the last major undammed watershed in the valley, in Sacramento Valley and in the state of California. So you don't really have situations like that where you're able to apply a lot of surface water. So as a result of that, we have some areas in the south that have had some groundwater overdraft, and they're really looking at some additional means for how they get the compliance with SGMA. So go ahead and advance my slide, please. So the project that I wanted to talk about today is actually ends up being 2 projects, and it's really kind of grown through time. So as I mentioned, down in the southern portion, so it's very rural. One of the stakeholders that we have had involved in our IRWM process since we started really engaging with that area in particular back in 2009 is the Omichumney-Hartnell Water District. And their general manager is a gentleman named Mike Wakeman. He's shown on the picture there on the upper right. And he came to me in 2011 with an idea to start doing some recharge along the Cosumnes River. And originally the plan was to partner with an upstream water district to take some of their surface water rights when they didn't need them and to construct an 80-acre basin where they were going to do recharge through ponding. And that could be done year round. And the original idea was to take up to 4,000 acre feet and recharge it into this basin. It was technically feasible, but it ended up not being very politically feasible. It wasn't a very popular idea to have this water district take and divert these waters out of the Cosumnes River when they were providing habitat value downstream throughout the year. So that sort of recharge was planned to happen 12 months a year as long as it was available. So Mike, he doesn't give up on things. He was ultimately going to look for a source of water. And through time, the project ultimately changed in its scope to really kind of focus more on that floodmar aspect of it. And so ultimately what they wanted to do was find water when it was available in the sort of November through March period when there were excess flows out in the system. For those of you who live in the Cosumnes, you do know that it's oftentimes subject to flooding, but there were opportunities that it seemed that they could capture that type of scenario. So Mike began looking for willing farmers to enlist and to get access to these lands. And he's currently working on a 10-year option to work on this program with an extension opportunity of another 10 years. And so ultimately the project that came out almost 10 years after they started doing the planning consists of this 1,100 acres of land, and they're able to actually then just divert water off of the Cosumnes River. You can see that's actually one of the diversion pumps that Mike is pointing at there, and then that's in the Rooney property there, that 376 acres shown in green. And so they can actually pump that water out, and they do have to have some minor improvements such as a distribution pipeline. You can see that in the picture there. It's a subgrade pipeline that they put in to move the water laterally around the fields. And so after a decade of trying, Mike was ultimately able to come up with a water source, and that's the more recent program for the stormwater recharge of groundwater through the State Water Board, the streamlined process. And so earlier this year in February, there was a 3-day event that they were able to capture water off of the river and divert it using that permit. And they were ultimately able to recharge an estimated 300 acre feet in just the 3 days. So unfortunately, and ironically, we're in such a dry year. I'm amazed that they actually had an opportunity to do this at all. But the transmissivity of this was so high, or the permeability, that the water didn't even reach the end of the fields before it fully went into the basin. So it's been a really good success story. They're still struggling with the sources of water. That stormwater permit program for them, a very small district with very small staff and limited financial resources, is still a bit of a barrier to large scale operations of this, but ultimately in this 1,100 acres, they are hoping to be able to recharge about 6,000 acre feet in these winter months on these dormant fields. So if you could advance my slide, please. And so more recently, and I should have mentioned on that previous project through the IRWM process, we were able to work with them and get them $1 million grant from Prop 84 back in 2011 to successfully start that project. Now, more recently, again, because of this IRWM role that we serve, we've been working with flood control interests. And in this case, we've been working with the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency, or SAFCA, and they have partnered up to start to expand this program. And more recently in the Prop 1 grant, we were able to help them secure $1 million to secure this new area shown in yellow. That yellow area is currently had a Swainson's Hawk conservation easement, but the local area wanted to secure that land so they could do additional recharge on it. So we were able to assist them in getting the $1 million to complete the purchase of another 127 acres. And so SAFCA is looking at opportunities to be able to move water down into that area to achieve additional recharge, and they're looking at many other areas as well. So the area there's doing a lot of technical research. There's electrical resistivity. You can see on the right, they've really created some very interesting pictures of the subsurface. And so they really have an understanding of where the water is going as it moves into the system. So with that, I'll kind of conclude up and we can answer questions later.
Thank you, Rob. A really great example how flood managed aquifer recharge and these multi-benefit approaches can be adapted to different watershed settings and groundwater conditions. So we do have Daniel Mountjoy back with us. And what I'd like to do, Daniel, is to ask you to rejoin us and conclude your remarks.
Thank you. I'm so sorry that it had bad connection there. I do now have a cell phone connection to it. So I believe from what I've heard from Emily that I was probably on these slides talking about the multi-benefit approaches. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, great. So I was speaking about using different groundwater models and surface water models to identify optimal locations for recharge to achieve different outcomes. So in this case, looking at where in the Merced Irrigation District water could most effectively be applied for maximizing retention within the basin would be in the dark blue. And then moving into thinking about if the goal for recharge is to optimize drinking water reliability for disadvantaged communities shown here in the purple outlines, recharge would be in the orange and yellow areas to benefit those domestic and municipal drinking water wells. And if the goal is to enhance shorebird habitat over here in the eastern area where the soils are heavier and water would be retained on the surface for migratory bird stopover feeding locations, those might be better locations to do recharge. Or if the recharge is intended for groundwater dependent ecosystems enhancement along the rivers to improve the riparian habitat, the dark area to the west would be a better location for doing recharge. So all of these show the trade-offs between different optimization strategies when we think about recharge, and not as simple as simply trying to maximize recharge across the landscape. And so for Sigma decision support, thinking through what the realistic expectations for recharge are becomes really important, and which project and whose projects or management actions will most cost effectively achieve that basin sustainability. And these are the kinds of questions that GSAs can be asking, but also IRWMs have already been asking in terms of identifying those water management objectives within their basins. So we really are starting to expand the notion from simply maximizing the capture of water to thinking about the environmental and social management objectives, whether it be drinking water or riparian habitat improvement or shorebird and wildlife habitat throughout the basin, both in upland and riparian areas. The most recent project that we've been working on is with the Turlock subbasin, where not only do we have a variety of different recharge opportunities, but a variety of different partners. In this case, it's a Sigma planning grant, Prop 68 planning grant, with 2 GSAs 4 irrigation districts and 3 cities. And coordinating all these various groups around identifying what their objectives are for the GSP can be informed by the IRWM priorities as well, which in their case prioritized increased groundwater storage and recharge, improved water supply, and also improved water quality. So in the process of bringing technical information to the districts through different models, we're now also able to help them ask some of these really important questions around what's the relative cost effectiveness of capturing water in different parts of the basin? What's the intra-district cost allocation to achieve the basin, overall basin sustainability? And by creating a shared view using best available data and science on groundwater opportunities across multiple jurisdictions. I think this is the real value of models and tools, is expanding those kind of conversations and dialogues, much the way that IRWM efforts have done throughout the state, combining that now with GSP planning processes and the various tools that are available in those processes through consultants and NGOs, we can start to ask better questions and answer them in a more comprehensive way. And then finally, I just wanted to mention infrastructure projects, thinking about different projects, all of which involve cost, thinking about the return on investment within the district as to which ones make the most sense and who should pay for them is another way to think it through. And then one just preview of another tool that Sustainable Conservation will be putting out here in the next couple of weeks is 2 documents on recharge water quality guidance. Water quality is a critical question when people are thinking about recharge and oftentimes is overlooked. And it's important to recognize that recharge can actually play an important role in enhancing drinking water quality, as I showed earlier in the Merced area. But also recharge can be done inadvertently, causing existing nitrates in the Legacy and the Vados zone to move into groundwater well systems if we're not thinking about the proximity and the loading and the current water quality. So our guidance, with much support from a variety of EJ groups and academics, will be coming out to show the trade-offs and encourage folks to think and communicate and engage with others who might be affected by recharge and the effects on water quality, so that you can actually maximize the benefits and avoid some of those unintended consequences that occur when legacy loading is accelerated through recharge application. Remembering that groundwater quality is going to decline whether we do recharge or not. Recharge can be used as a tool to move that water and dilute it when it's well planned. So I will leave it at that, Kamyar, and turn it back over to you. And apologies for the interruption.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm so pleased that you were able to reconnect and finish your remarks and be with us for the rest of the webinar. So with that, I'd like to ask Mike Brinton to share his thoughts. Mike?
Perfect, thank you. I work for Stanislaus County, and we currently have a project working with Dry Creek, which is on the north side of the Tuolumne River. And it has about 137,000 acres, or 215 square miles. And the flow in Dry Creek is unregulated, which creates some problems. We have obtained a grant from an IRWM grant through DWR to study the possibility of regulating the flow to minimize downstream flooding for disadvantaged communities in Modesto and increase the groundwater recharge. Our initial plan is to provide several structures along the way to retain the high water, drain water during the high intensity flows. And this is going to lower the impact on the Dry Creek flows into the Tuolumne, and which will also modify the ability to release capacity from Don Pedro Dam. At the same time the water has been retained, it can be transferred to underground storage to supplement the aquifers that have been overdrafted in the east part of the county for years. As you're probably all aware, there's significant areas in the eastern portion of Modesto and the Turlock groundwater subbasins where the groundwater levels are more than 100 feet below the surface. These areas will provide an available reservoir for storage with excellent capacity and groundwater retention characteristics. We work with the Modesto Subbasin, which consists of Stanislaus and Tuolumne River groundwater basin associations, and the Turlock Subbasins, which is East Turlock Subbasin and the West Turlock Subbasin. In order to work toward groundwater retention, we're working with both the Modesto Irrigation District and the Turlock Irrigation District, along with the subbasins for Turlock and Modesto. We anticipate that we're going to be able to be successful. Initially, we have just a few spots where we're going to put some kind of controls. We'd like to be able to put more, and we really need to supplement the groundwater. Am I used up my time? I think I have.
I think
back to you.
if you have more to say, you have a few more minutes.
That's okay.
Okay, well, thank you, Mike. And what's neat about this is, when we talk about floodmar, we're often thinking of agricultural working land setting. And with stormwater, it often has a nexus with urban areas. And the neat thing is that the same approaches and benefits, similar benefits, can be realized working in both working landscapes as in urban settings. So what we want to do now is I'd like to ask one question of each of our panelists to kind of get your juices going. And while we're doing that, I encourage you to enter your questions in the Q&A function. And then after we get through with the panelists' 3 questions, we're going to open it up to Q&A with all the participants. So let me first come to you, Mike. So what role do you think the state government can play to help integrated regional water management groups and groundwater sustainability agencies work more closely to connect groundwater recharge and other projects?
Really simple. What all the places need is money. And if we have funding so that we can do the studies and then implement those studies, that is the secret to making everybody get along.
Thank you, Mike. And I guess part of that is how can the financial assistance or incentive get people to the table to get people to come and get along, as you put it. So Rob, how can GSAs and IRWM groups approach groundwater recharge projects together to get further faster? What do you think each can contribute, and what would their mutual benefits be?
Well, with the caveat that nothing happens fast in this world that we're dealing with, I do think there's a lot of advantages. And I think that the projects that I'm referring to today are really beneficiaries of that. And I think to begin with, when you go back over IRWM, one of the things that we do is we really do this sort of aspirational planning, very high level. We bring together a lot of stakeholders and a lot of stakeholder interests. And I think that that is one of the biggest values. And in particular, as I was alluding to with the last, form of this project, flood control really wasn't traditionally a portion of what was happening in the region. The SAFCA actually operates on the American River system. And so there really was no direct connection with the Cosumnes or even the mission of SAFCA. But their need to address additional flood control issues partnered up with the groundwater issues that were occurring down in the Cosumnes Basin. And a lot of that all happened through the IRWM environment. So a lot of these, stakeholders were brought together through that process. So I think there was a lot of value in that. Of course, IRWMs have access to funding, and we do hope that that would continue on to match up with Michael said, that the role that could be played. we have been able to help them secure funding. And the GSAs themselves, sort of more recently, SGMA is a much more compelling reason for management, right? So IRWM has been doing aspirational planning, and we have objectives, but we may or may not meet those at the end of the day. Whereas SGMA has accountability. You really have to bring these basins into balance. And so it's really sort of given this compelling need to address these issues. So with the GSAs coming in, we've been able to utilize some Prop 68 funds in particular to do some of the research that I referred to on the Cosumnes River Recharge Project. And ultimately, and it's really going to depend on the area that you're working in, but GSAs have the authority to collect fees to fund projects as well. So I think that they all have their strengths. We have access to grant funds. We can work together to bring together the non-traditional stakeholders. And I should mention that, SAFCA is an agency with a lot of need for flood control and a lot of capacity. And they're working in this very rural area, which has very limited population, very little, either staffing or financial resources to, implement some of these projects. So that's where I think the big value comes in. And lastly, I would say IRWM, as you can see in our area, covers a larger area than most of these GSAs do. So with that sort of comes a little more clout, sort of geographically. We have more representatives, more elected representatives that overlay this area. And so traditionally, when a smaller area has needed some help, they've kind of come to us and sought support letters and other types of things. So we think that the IRWM process carries some clout to it too, that can help those smaller GSAs.
Great, Rob. Appreciate that response. And maybe the last question to Daniel before we open it up to everyone else. What are some of the lessons learned from your demonstrations projects and research that IRWM groups and GSAs can learn from?
Well, building on what Rob said, I think under SGMA, that is the prime driver that many of these recharge projects are coming out of, both on the part of individual farmers and with the irrigation districts that we've been working with, and now the GSAs. And again, I think expanding the thinking about recharge is an opportunity not just to maximize groundwater storage, but to think about the other opportunities it offers. Really starts to leverage other funding sources, as Rob said. It's fairly straightforward to think about diverting flood flows for recharge. And a lot of folks are thinking about that benefit. Tulare Irrigation District did a wonderful job of maximizing recharge for a disadvantaged community by building a recharge basin just up gradient from that community. It achieved the basin recharge goals, but it specifically helped an individual community that was at risk of losing water. Some of these questions are more complex in terms of the trade-offs. And I think the IRWMs are grappling with that in the ranking processes being used between evaluating different kinds of projects. And again, as Rob pointed out, the broader engagement of a variety of different elected officials and other stakeholders can help inform the GSP management strategies and priorities to try and maximize those outcomes. And of course, then attract the other funding sources that makes possible. So I think building that broader stakeholder support and attracting funding is an obvious value that GSAs should be looking to working with IRWMs more.
Thanks, Daniel. And while our panelists have been responding to my questions, we've got close to 10 questions already submitted in the Q&A for our panelists. And so, and thanks to Emily, who's been compiling and organizing those questions. I'm gonna go ahead and just read them in the order that she has. And then Emily, I'll leave it to you to let us know when the time for this Q&A period is coming to a close. So we have a question from Mary Elizabeth, and she asks, how can the Drinking Water Source Assessment and Protection Program be linked to IRWM plans and SGMA plans to help increasing stormwater quality for groundwater recharge? And I'll just leave it to the panelists. You can jump in and take turns responding to the questions.
Well, I guess I'll jump in on a part of this. Certainly stormwater quality is a big question that's up in the air, and Rob, and we've looked at some of this in SACO area too. You know, the urban runoff or water has very different water quality than a river flooding, you know, down the snowmelt river water sources. So the water quality guidance that we've been working on, that will be coming out later this month, is really focused more on clean river water and managing that to enhance drinking water supplies and source protection. Maybe somebody else wants to talk about the stormwater source.
So Mike, anything to add on stormwater management?
Stormwater from the cities, you know, is a real problem, because that really needs to be treated before you can do anything with it. So whether we can afford to build a treatment plant for stormwater, it's the volumes of water are so high that's a real problem cost-wise.
Okay, so treatment may have to be part of that co-management and integrated approach to take sources of water available for groundwater recharge. So we have a question from Anonymous, so I'll go ahead and read it. How can NGOs interested in working on environmental justice issues with disadvantaged communities apply for IRWM funding? Is there a place where NGOs can see which IRWM plans are actively seeking funding opportunities for disadvantaged communities? So Kamyar, so I can certainly start by noting that the Department of Water Resources has a IRWM grant program. And one of the links I provided in the resources is to that website. And there it is clearly delineated which of the grants and how much is available specifically for projects in disadvantaged communities. And I think it would then be best, depending on which area of the state an NGO was wanting to work. DWR has a map that shows all the IRWM groups throughout the state. And that way you would know who to contact. It has contact information to answer some of these questions. Would any of the panelists have anything to add?
Yeah, Kamyar, I would add in that the State Department of Water Resources runs a very distinct disadvantaged community involvement program through Proposition 1. So from that, each of the funding areas in the state has a single point of contact for these what they call DACI program. And really the mission of that was to identify specific issues in disadvantaged communities and types of projects and support that can benefit them. So they could contact somebody at DWR there, Kamyar, but this program has really already been laid out, and they really should just approach that specific funding area. Each one of them is managed by one of the IRWM groups.
Thanks for that, Rob. And certainly, if you can't find what you're looking for on the IRWM website, my contact information is part of this webinar. So don't hesitate to contact me, and I'll connect you with folks at DWR to get the information that you're looking for. So with that, I'll go to the next question, also anonymous. How do you see all the potential for the statewide aerial electromagnetic surveys, or often called AEM, beginning in July this year and continuing for 3 to 5 years, to assist in recharge projects, both in terms of providing new technical information to connect the dots between well data and in helping bring stakeholder interests together?
I can start on that one for sure. It's really critical information for us to be able to identify where those optimal locations are, both for land use planning so that we don't pave over those really high permeable locations that allow surface water to move quickly into the aquifer. For those that haven't heard about the AEM surveys, they're working to identify where you have coarse grade material that allows rapid infiltration of surface water into groundwater. And they would allow us to protect those areas and focus recharge in those limited areas to achieve greater impact. One of the benefits is you have less extensive recharge across the landscape, which means less legacy nutrients and other contaminants get flushed because you can focus on a few locations. But I do bring it back to the idea that if you focus all the recharge in those locations, you will do well for the overall aquifer, but you may not target the areas where more shallow aquifer depletion may be causing problems, like riparian areas, groundwater dependent ecosystems, and communities. So it's not the only answer. It's an important part of it, and it will certainly help inform, and it should show results in well log data if we can start to target those locations.
And Daniel, let me just ask you, folks who already have a GRAT tool, the groundwater recharge assessment tool, or looking to develop it, right now, as I understand it, it uses the SAGB, the UC Davis SAGB data to identify different recharge potential. Would the AEM data basically update that information in the GRAT tool?
So actually GRAT uses SAGB along with the Central Valley Hydrologic Model. So SAGB is only good for the top 6 feet of soil suitability. And below that, we've relied on the Central Valley Hydrologic Model coarseness characteristics from well log data. So it would provide a continuous coverage of that coarseness at all depths reviewed by the scan. So it would be a significant improvement on understanding the hydrogeologic structure.
Thank you. So let's keep moving on. We have Sam Schaefer says, "Hi, Daniel. What flood water south of the Delta is available going forward in California?" There's a broad question.
Yeah, I'm trying to parse this out. I guess I'm assuming it's asking what floodwater that is locally available south of the Delta is available going forward. Now, I would just refer to the PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California's reports, saying that runoff from the Sierra Nevada in the San Joaquin and Tulare basins can provide about 25% of our overdraft needs in that region. So floodwater is, of course, the source that everyone's looking to right now. It's not an end-all solution. It's certainly an important part of reaching groundwater sustainability, but it is limited to 25, maybe 30%. And with climate change, there may be larger gulps that are going to need to be taken if the storms are more concentrated. So I hope I'm answering the question that Sam's asking there.
Thank you, Daniel. So the next question is from Stefan Julian, and asking what opportunities are available for smaller on-farm recharge projects? And similarly, how can a GSA or subbasin incorporate urban or suburban water infrastructure, such as green infrastructure, for stormwater infiltration in the groundwater accounting?
Mike, you were talking about the on-farm, or I can cover that one.
Yeah, please.
Well, finding a place, if we're talking about finding a place in an urban area to store the water in order to get it to go into the ground is a little bit of a problem. which means you got to pump it someplace else to a farm someplace that's willing to accept it. It's such a different deal of an urban as opposed to an agricultural area for groundwater recharge, just a completely different animal.
So does that
I would
involve?
say,
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, as I showed in one of my early slides, there's a lot of opportunity for smaller on-farm recharge projects. And I think if we just look at where the infrastructure already exists, all of the irrigated acreage using surface water supplies in the San Joaquin Valley or Sacramento Valley, all of those farms potentially have the ability to take water for recharge, provided their soil and subsurface conditions are appropriate. So we probably have more acreage than we have water in terms of capturing it. And so it really comes down to prioritizing, which crops are compatible, when's the timing of that water. And this has been a big issue that we've been doing in our modeling, is that the floodwater flows don't really occur during the winter when most cropland can take water. The snow melt has usually been in the springtime when the crops are planted or the perennial crops are already out of their dormancy. And so finding enough acreage in April and May during big snowmelt years is one of our biggest challenges. So it's a combination, it really is a combination of on-farm recharge and dedicated recharge basins, perhaps located on top of those sites that are identified by the aerial electromagnetic imaging. They're going to be the portfolio of recharge systems are going to be needed, along with floodplains and expanded floodplain capture for capturing big runoff events and letting it infiltrate more slowly, because some of those sites aren't the best for rapid infiltration, but they provide a lot of habitat value and provide flood mitigation and some recharge.
The one thing I will add is there is a lot of experience in information about recharge in urban settings from stormwater, particularly our coastal areas where they capture stormwater flowing toward the ocean and either use recharge basins and or injection wells to get that water into the ground. So there's a lot of information, the point being to learn from what others have done in this regard. So moving on, we have a question from David Vang, and he would like to know what permits were required for each of the projects that were presented today.
So I'll start. Fortunately,
Yeah,
in the project, it was really pretty simple, just getting the stormwater recharge permit. They were fortunate in that the diversions already existed off of the river. Obviously, that would have increased the complexity pretty significantly to be working in the stream bed itself. So ordinarily, that is going to be required if you're starting from scratch, and that's not available.
And similarly, for all of the projects that we've worked on with irrigation districts, all of these recharge district-wide recharge projects had pre-1914 water rights and all the existing diversion systems in place. And so they were able to use their existing allocations or in some cases 215 water from the federal supply side. And there was no earth moving involved on the sites for on-farm recharge. So no grading permits, no other disturbance type activities.
and Mike, I know you're early in the project planning for what you presented. Do you have a sense of what permits you'll likely need to apply for to implement that project?
Well, yeah, we're going to need a number of permits. First of all, dealing with the individual property owners is a problem. With the, different crops in the springtime, maybe grapes take it and almonds don't. We see that as one of our biggest things we're going to have to overcome. There is a problem, as it appears, of getting a permit from the state for moving the water to areas other than where the tributary areas for Dry Creek is. If we're going to move it down to Turlock or back to the east. I see that as a major hurdle.
And you brought up water rights, and I will note that the State Water Board actually has a guidance on how to get water right clearances or permits for floodmar type projects. And it depends on the type of project and the length or the duration of the request. And there are the temporary permits. They have what they call the streamline approach, and then basically the permanent water applications for a permanent water right. And so that information is posted on the State Water Board website. And again, if you have trouble finding that, drop me an email and I'll hook you up.
Streamline might be a misnomer.
Well, it's streamlined relative to the permanent water right application process, which is much more involved. So I think it was relative to that, not some other criteria, Mike. So we have another question from Willie Kunal, and I apologize if I mispronounced your last name. Asking some real fundamental questions, kind of what we started touching on. So who pays for these recharge projects? Who owns the rights to the water? Does the beneficiary pay? And how can the state help protect the gains in water and storage for sustainability with additional SGMA legislation? So there's some meaty questions for our panelists.
Yeah. I'll start out with a sort of just a distinction I think it's important to make, that several of the districts that we've worked with see the water as district water, because they are the ones that have the water rights to that water. And they make that water available to their growers as a service. But if they're making it available to a grower for recharge purposes, which benefits the whole basin, they are choosing to subsidize that with district revenues because the benefit of that groundwater then accrues to everyone. The landowner that does the recharge doesn't have a higher quota in terms of pumping, is how they've been thinking about it. But it's a service, it's a district service, and they can either incentivize that through free water or through other future incentives to make that water available to the community. It's in a sense, it's the same as investing in an infrastructure project, except that you're investing in this dispersed system across the landscape with individual landowners. Other regions further south typically think of this as water banking, and in a water banking structure, the person that recharges gains credit to that water. And so we're just seeing a distinction. Sort of the further north you go, it's generally viewed as a community or a district-wide value and revenue or asset, and further south, it's more of an individual asset. But these are evolving right now as we speak, and with SGMA, the districts can assess fees across all landowners to pay for the projects, or they can do it through cost incentives through the pricing of water.
Yeah, and I think kind of underpinning of your response, Daniel, is that to make these work, it takes people from different constituencies and communities to work together, because some manage the surface water, others have the land that can be used for groundwater recharge, and then the question of how to get the water from where it's stored down to those properties, and ultimately, or additionally, to get some of the environmental benefits, working with the appropriate NGOs and or regulatory resource agencies to basically confirm that what is being proposed would provide those benefits. So again, back to something that I keep coming back to is to make the water shed and the water cycle function most effectively the way it was evolved. It has evolved over millennia. We have to begin eroding and removing some of the human created boundaries that we've added, and to make it more streamlined, if I can use that word, in implementing these surface groundwater ecosystem related projects. So let's keep moving. We have Susan Pecci, and she asks, Suzanne Pecci, and she asks, what is the role of large areas of ag residential parcels? What role do they play in recharge? What types of recharge projects could be funded to recharge aquifers for these well owners who rely on groundwater as their sole source of water? And how could these programs be monetarily incentivized to encourage their participation while at the same time financially benefit similar to large landowners in a district? So basically, what kinds of incentive and financial programs could be set up to get more of the landowners, particularly the smaller parcel landowners, participating in these kinds of flood, mar, or stormwater recharge projects?
So I will
yeah,
start at that.
I was just coming to you, Rob. Thank you.
Suzanne is a stakeholder in my IRWM region, so I'm happy to answer this question. As you can see, Suzanne, we've already started by the project that Omachami's been working on, working with some of these parcels to get the recharge occurring in the winter months. Now, the immediate benefit is that water levels come up in those areas. So for those who are relying on groundwater, you're actually hopefully going to lower your expenses and bring groundwater levels up on the whole. So there's a benefit that way. But as you're aware, we are looking in the region, within the IRWM region itself, in the North and the South American Subbasin, and we believe the Cosumnes Basin will also be a part of this, is establishing a water bank, as Daniel was alluding to. And we're basically looking to store water in wet periods and then recover it in dry years through the use of groundwater locally. But what that does is frees us up opportunities to participate in groundwater substitution transfers, and thereby generating revenue to help pay for these programs. So some of these independent areas can take surface water in wet years when it's available, and to the degree there's a water right associated with it that is then transferable in a dry year like this year, we can have a transfer program that generates revenue. So we have a modeling tool that we've built for SGMA that covers all of these subbasins so that we can do detailed accounting of the water that goes in. It's a lot easier when it's associated with a water right or contract to account for it. Sort of the challenge is when you're taking flood water and you're recharging it, what is the water right associated with that? So when you go back at some future time to recover it, is it then transferable? So there are a lot of technical details for us to work out on how that all gets treated in an accounting system. But ultimately, number one objective is the sustainability of the basin and the habitat that's supported by that. But we do believe that by having programs like this and enlisting a lot of landowners, I referred earlier to some of the in lieu projects that we have. One of the largest ones is called Harvest Water. So that's the Sacramento Regional Sanitation District is looking to deliver recycled water over the next few years down into that South County portion. That can then displace water that's currently being used in the form of groundwater by these local landowners. And they can be very small to large. And ultimately, we can account for that water being put into the system. And then that creates these opportunities for these groundwater substitution transfers in dry years.
Thank you, Rob. Let's keep moving. We have a question from Rick Iger. And he asked, has there been any analysis on crop yield impacts with sustained winter recharge on vineyards and tree crops?
It sounds like one I should probably jump on. Rick, yeah, it was an area that I mentioned early on, that when we asked the growers who were interested in recharge, what were their biggest barriers, were questions about agronomic impacts. And we now have 10 years of, well, I shouldn't say 10 years. 10 years have passed. We've had 3 years of water availability to actually evaluate this. There have been some good studies done by UC Davis. Helen Dahlke's group has done a study on almonds and also on alfalfa, and I believe on pistachios. And the almond board has, definitely was concerned about this practice on their tree crops, root health. And the conclusions have been that the winter applied water during dormancy has not caused significant impacts or any real yield impacts, differentiated from other crops in a wet year with a lot of rainfall. Vineyards in particular have been able to take a lot of water. Vines typically are a plant that evolved in floodplain situations. We had one vineyard in San Joaquin County that has taken 19 feet of water in a 3-week period in the winter without any harm. We've seen a variety of other tree crops take significant amounts of water, even into the growing season, without any significant problems. Though there are some concerns about some root health pathogens that can build up if you have too long an inundation with warmer water. So this is still a question that has to be answered, but with caution, this seems to not be as big a concern as it originally was thought to be. But we're still waiting for the science to come in on it.
Thank you, Daniel. And one thing I'll add is a couple of years ago, Department of Water Resources helped facilitate what we call the FloodMar Research and Data Development effort and report. And Daniel was one of the co-leads of that effort. And that is that report, the plan, is posted on the DWR FloodMar webpage that I provided the link to. And the reason I bring that up is about 200 people worked to identify what are the data gaps that need to be filled to do kind of scale up FloodMar in California. And an area of the recommendations is just about what Daniel was talking about, is which crops and how could they be part of a FloodMar program.
And for those of you that are, don't want to wait for the studies come out that have already done some of this type of recharge, please contact me if you have any anecdotal experience on this. Our agronomist would love to interview you and see what we can learn from you. That's how we've been collecting as much as we can to this point while the science and research is being conducted.
Thank you, Daniel. So we have a question from Mike Busby, and he asks, is IRWM and DWR helping districts create recharge programs and necessary contracts for individual farmers rather than just with the district owner and their recharge systems? So I guess I can speak to the DWR part. If you recall, one of the slides I showed for our FloodMar efforts include pilot projects. So DWR, again, given the resources we have has embarked on partnering with 4 or 5 efforts, both in northern Sac Valley as well as the San Joaquin Valley. And it's focused on plan formulation. So we really haven't come up with the funding or the contracting, but I will say this, that you may be familiar with the YOLO bypass and how that is used during flood events to divert water from the Sacramento River, and it goes on to what are rice fields. And DWR does have contracts with those landowners for being able to use their property as a floodway, a flood bypass during those high flow periods. So this is not something that hasn't been done before. We just need to kind of fashion what it could look like for a floodmar operations. Anybody else want to add into that question?
I would also just add individual landowners in this next year will be able to receive funding from the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They're adding a cost share program for on-farm recharge as well as district recharge activities. So that's going to be another funding opportunity. And I guess I would just say that in terms of the actual program, creating the recharge program, from what we've heard from districts, everyone wants to set it up in different ways. So I wasn't sure, Mike, if your question was, is there funding support or if this is help in designing the programs themselves? But I think it's really important that as different programs get set up, we share that knowledge with others so that people can choose and pick which parts make sense to them rather than everyone trying to reinvent on their own. And that's something hopefully that the Floodmar network can play a role in supporting.
Thank you, Daniel. So we have a question from Anonymous. Sierra Nevada may not have the capacity in many years. How are the GSAs, IRWM accounting for long-term drought? The predictions are that we will have great variability among years. How is this prediction being considered?
So I'll take a crack at that. We really recently concluded a study in the American River Basin looking at the effects of long-term climate change. And really the scenario that's being described is exactly what concerns us the most, right? It's why we're looking so heavily at utilizing these groundwater basins for storage in these surplus years. You have to do this, right? You have 3 reservoir systems. You have your snowpack, which is changing dramatically. It is then reducing the ability of these surface water reservoir systems to regulate that snowpack. And ultimately you're left with the groundwater basin. And really it's a question of scale at that point. It's what I love about groundwater basins. They're huge. And unfortunately, in some areas we had the foresight to create a lot of storage space in them. We started a program a couple of decades ago because we had overdraft in the region. We estimate we have about 2 million acre feet of storage space available in the groundwater basin, which is twice the size of our local Folsom Reservoir. The challenge is how do you operate it, right? Surface water reservoir happens on the scale of days, whereas groundwater is on the scale of years. So really, I mean, the scenario you're describing is what we're trying to address. And it's really about how do you get groundwater in the system when that surface water is available. And it's an all hands method, right? It does have to include floodmar, but it also has to include an area that you can in years using simply water right water, as we do in the urban area. When we have that water available, we serve it to areas that would traditionally have been using groundwater, allowing the groundwater basin to recover naturally. So you really have to look at all these methods, and that's exactly what we're trying to do in our region.
Well said.
Thank you, Rob. And one thing I would add to Rob's great reply is that there is a lot of research and studies being done on atmospheric rivers, and much of California's precipitation comes in a handful, if we're lucky, of these atmospheric rivers on an annual basis. And the research is working to do a better job of predicting when and where these atmospheric rivers will enter or come to California from the Pacific Ocean. And that information is also helping what is called forecast informed reservoir operations. So the better we can anticipate the approach of an atmospheric river, And these are in terms of several days to a week or more. The reservoirs that will likely be impacted can be drawn down, and it would be great if we had a floodmar program to be able to basically sink that released water into the ground for later use and make more space in the reservoir to capture the oncoming atmospheric river. Okay, so we have another question, anonymous. Soil aquifer and recharge is a treatment of stormwater. So how can we overcome the Water Board's requirement for stormwater management plans to receive money for stormwater projects? This is a constraint to progress. So let me just say this. I certainly am not going to speak for the Water Board on this, but if you recall, one of the points I wanted to make is that our sectors and our institutions have sliced and diced the way water is managed on the ground or on the surface and under the ground. And that includes our regulatory programs that are state and federal. And we've worked in our silos. We've optimized things for our particular sector, but without recognizing that there are and can be impacts that were not intended to other sectors. And so what we also have to do is think about optimizing system-wide, not for a particular sector in the future. So many of the stormwater regulations, floodwater regulations, groundwater regulations, they have been all fashioned in their particular silo. And what we're going to have to do as a state is begin coming up with regulations that encourage and support these multi-benefit, multi-sector projects. Anybody else want to take that one on? Okay, let's keep going. Andy Ramirez has a question. And Andy asks, how has it been overall, how is the overall cost effectiveness for other agencies during stormwater recharge basin projects? What's the return on investment? So Mike, thinking of your stormwater drainage district, what things do you consider?
Boy, the return on investment, that's a tough one. You know, first of all, you got to figure out how much it's going to cost to do it. Are you going to have to pay to have someone put the water on their property? And are you going to charge somebody after it's there to take it out? I'm trying to find the good answer, but I don't have it.
And I would just have to say, to me, it's Andy, it's practically a rhetorical question. I think you're asking. It's very difficult to have a positive return on investment from managing stormwater in particular. And I think that's the value, though, of the IRWM approach that we've had. We really try to bring in as many interests as we can and try to make those investments sort of jointly. And ultimately, there are points at which you have to, look at alternatives to quantifying the value of that in terms of dollars and looking at it in terms of benefits for, water quality management or other avoided types of costs. So it's a real challenge. I think, again, that it does emphasize the value of IRWM, at least that it helps to offset some of that negative return on investment.
Thank you, Rob. Well, folks, we are almost out of time. I'm going to turn it back to Emily. There's about 5 or 6 questions we couldn't get to, but we'll find a way to, weigh in on those in the future. So, Emily.
Thank you, Kamyar, and thank you to Rob, Mike, and Daniel for your time and all of your wisdom today. We really appreciate the discussion, and to our participants, really great questions, and glad we got so much time to run through those questions. Chris, if you can launch our last poll. I know we're at time, but would love to get feedback from you all on what topics we may address in future IRWM Sigma webinars. We have about 6 topics there. While you are completing the poll, I just want to remind everyone that the recording from today's discussion will be shared with you all, in addition to all of the great resources that our speakers have shared with us and that I have shared in the chat. So with that, Chris, how are we doing on our poll count?
We have some people answering. I'll just leave it up for a while here, and we all sign off. Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you to everyone who came today. We'll be in touch with the resources.
Okay, great. And I'll just make one last plug. Chris and I will be tag teaming this time next week on another webinar related to 2022 GSPs and lessons learned from our 2020 Groundwater Leadership Forum GSP review. I'm just going to plop a link in the chat. If you'd like to find out more about that webinar series, our webinar next Monday will be focused on disadvantaged community engagement in drinking water. And with that, if you've answered the poll, we'll go ahead and let you all go. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon, and hope you have a great summer solstice.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Chris, can you launch the results? Just out of curiosity, I'd love to see. Coordinating land use planning across Sigma and IRWMs. Coming at the top, we've got climate change and watershed scale planning as the next, tied for second priority, and then DAC engagement success stories as the third priority. Interesting. We will make note. We have been in conversation with the California American Planning Association about a joint Sigma land use planning webinar, so that may be what's up next on the docket.
Great. Well, thank you. This has been a real pleasure for me, and I appreciate the panelists and all your support, Emily and Chris.
Appreciate
Great
all you
questions
coming
coming
to. Appreciate everyone participating today. What a great panel, a bunch of rock stars. So thanks.
Thank you.
Right.
Until next time.
Sorry about the internet problems. I lost it again. I'm on the phone.
You're
right.
a champ.
Have a
You're a
great day.
champ, Daniel. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike and Kamyar.
Bye-bye.
Rob.
Okay. Until next
Take
time.
care.
Enjoy
Bye-bye.
the rest of your day, everyone.
You too. Bye-bye.
Indeed.